On the night of July 18, 64 AD, Rome began to burn. For 6 days and 7 nights, flames consumed the eternal city. And when the ashes finally settled, all of Rome had one question: did their emperor start the fire? To understand what really happened during those terrible days in July, we need to understand the man at the center of the controversy, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the fifth emperor of Rome. A man who would become one of history's most infamous rulers. But here's what most people don't know: Nero didn't start out as a monster. When he took the throne at just 16 years old in 54 AD, Romans were actually optimistic. His early reign was marked by competent governance, guided by his advisors, the philosopher Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus. He reduced taxes. He gave the Senate more authority. He banned capital punishment. For 5 years, this period was so peaceful and prosperous that historians would later call it the Quinquennium Neronis, Nero's golden 5 years. So what changed? What transformed this promising young emperor into the tyrant we remember today? The answer lies in Nero's greatest passion: not politics, not military conquest, but art. Nero didn't just love the arts, he was obsessed with them. He fancied himself a musician, a poet, a singer, an actor. He would perform publicly, sometimes for hours, and no one was allowed to leave during his performances. Ancient historians record that women gave birth in the audience rather than risk offending the emperor by departing. Men pretended to die so they could be carried out. This wasn't the behavior Romans expected from their emperor. Roman aristocratic culture viewed performing artists as little better than slaves. For an emperor to perform on stage was considered deeply shameful, a degradation of imperial dignity. But Nero didn't care. He craved artistic glory more than military victory. By the early 60s AD, Nero's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and disturbing. He had his own mother, Agrippina, murdered in 59 AD after years of her attempts to control him. He divorced and exiled his first wife, Octavia, then had her executed. He kicked his pregnant second wife, Poppaea, to death in a fit of rage, though some sources say she died in childbirth. He was draining the imperial treasury to fund lavish artistic festivals and his own performances. But underneath all this personal drama, Nero harbored a grand vision. He dreamed of transforming Rome itself, rebuilding it as a magnificent planned city that would showcase his artistic genius and stand as his eternal monument. The problem was Rome as it existed, a chaotic warren of narrow streets, ancient buildings, and centuries of unplanned growth. The city had grown organically over 800 years, and much of it was, frankly, a fire hazard. Rome in 64 AD was home to over 1 million people, making it the largest city in the ancient world. Most Romans lived in cramped apartment buildings called insulae, often poorly constructed, multi-story tenements that towered precariously over narrow, winding streets. These streets were so packed with people, animals, carts, and goods that movement through the city could take hours. Fires were common. The city had burned partially many times before. For an emperor with dreams of architectural grandeur, this Rome must have seemed like an obstacle. And then came the night of July 18, 64 AD. Rome in 64 AD was home to over 1 million people, making it the largest city in the ancient world. Most Romans lived in cramped apartment buildings called insulae, often poorly constructed, multi-story tenements that towered precariously over narrow, winding streets. These streets were so packed with people, animals, carts, and goods that movement through the city could take hours. Fires were common. The city had burned partially many times before. For an emperor with dreams of architectural grandeur, this Rome must have seemed like an obstacle. And then came the night of July 18, 64 AD. The flames erupted with terrifying speed. What started as a small blaze in the merchant shops at the southeastern end of the Circus Maximus quickly became an unstoppable inferno. The wind that night was strong and unpredictable, carrying embers across streets and onto rooftops. Within an hour, entire blocks were burning. Within 3 hours, the fire had spread to multiple districts of the city. Imagine you're a Roman citizen, asleep in your third-floor apartment in one of those cramped insulae buildings. You wake to screaming. You smell smoke. You rush to your window and see flames leaping from building to building across the narrow street. The stairwell, the only way out, is already filling with smoke. You have minutes, maybe seconds, to grab your family and flee. Everything you own, everything your family has accumulated over generations, will be left behind. This was the nightmare that unfolded for hundreds of thousands of Romans that night. The city's narrow streets, normally packed with people and carts, became death traps. Families fled with whatever they could carry, pushing through crowds of terrified neighbors, all trying to escape the advancing flames. The elderly and sick were trampled or left behind. Children were separated from parents in the chaos. The smoke alone was killing people who couldn't escape fast enough. Ancient historian Tacitus, who was a child during the fire and later interviewed survivors, described the scene. The blaze in its fury ran first through the level portions of the city, then rising to the hills, while it again devastated every place below them, outstripped all preventive measures. So rapid was the mischief and so completely at its mercy was the city, with those narrow winding passages and irregular streets which characterized old Rome. The Roman fire brigades, the vigiles, responded immediately, but they were overwhelmed from the start. These firefighters normally handled small blazes and could contain them by demolishing nearby buildings to create fire breaks. But this fire was different. It was moving too fast, consuming too much, and the wind kept shifting direction, making it impossible to predict where it would strike next. By dawn on July 19, Rome's most sacred and ancient districts were burning. The fire consumed the Temple of Luna, the great altar and shrine of Hercules, and temples that had stood for centuries. It devoured the Regia, the ancient palace of Rome's kings. Priceless artifacts, irreplaceable scrolls, and sacred objects that connected Rome to its legendary founding were reduced to ashes. And where was Emperor Nero during all of this? This is where history gets complicated, where fact and propaganda become dangerously mixed. According to the location that matters most, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was 35 miles away at his villa in Antium, on the coast. When word reached him that Rome was burning, the ancient sources agree on one thing: Nero rushed back to the city immediately. He arrived to find Rome transformed into hell on earth. The fire was now into its second day and showed no signs of stopping. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The death toll was climbing by the hour, though exact numbers would never be known. Many bodies were simply consumed by the flames. Here's what we know Nero actually did, confirmed by multiple ancient sources: he opened his gardens and the public buildings he controlled to provide shelter for the displaced. He had emergency supplies of food brought in from the neighboring port of Ostia and sold at drastically reduced prices. Some sources say he gave food away for free to prevent starvation. He organized more systematic firefighting efforts and personally supervised the demolition of buildings to create fire breaks. For 3 days, the emperor barely slept, coordinating the emergency response. And then, on the 4th day, the fire finally began to die down. Romans breathed a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was ending. They had lost much, but they had survived. They could begin to rebuild. Then, on the 6th day, the fire erupted again. This second outbreak started on an estate belonging to Tigellinus, the Praetorian prefect and one of Nero's closest advisors. It consumed areas the first fire had missed, including more temples and public buildings. This second fire lasted 3 more days before it was finally extinguished. And this is when the rumors started. The coincidence seemed too perfect. A second fire, starting on property connected to the emperor's inner circle, destroying more of the old city that Nero allegedly wanted to rebuild. Romans began to whisper. Some claimed they had seen men actively preventing firefighting efforts. Others said they witnessed people deliberately starting new fires. Stories spread that these arsonists, when confronted, claimed they were acting under orders, though they never specified whose orders. Were these stories true? Were they the paranoid fantasies of a traumatized population looking for someone to blame? Or were they propaganda spread by Nero's enemies? We may never know for certain. But the rumors took hold, and they spread through the refugee camps and emergency shelters faster than the fire itself had spread through Rome's streets. When the flames were finally extinguished on July 24, 6 days after the fire began, the scope of the catastrophe became clear. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained untouched. 3 districts had been completely destroyed, not a single building left standing. 7 more had been severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. The death toll, never accurately recorded, likely numbered in the thousands. Ancient temples dating back centuries were gone. Priceless artwork was destroyed. The Temple of Jupiter Stator, the Regia, the House of the Vestal Virgins, countless shrines and sanctuaries, all reduced to rubble and ash. Rome, the eternal city, the center of the civilized world, had been nearly destroyed. And Emperor Nero stood in the ruins of his capital, facing a population that increasingly believed he had burned it deliberately. What he did next would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of an entirely new religious movement that was just beginning to take root in the empire. The persecution was about to begin. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Nero did something that would seal his reputation for 2,000 years. While tens of thousands of Romans were still living in makeshift camps among the ruins, while families were searching desperately for missing loved ones, while the city still smoldered, Nero announced his plans for a new Rome. And at the center of those plans was something extraordinary, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Nero's new palace complex would be unlike anything Rome, or the world, had ever seen. The scale was staggering. The Golden House would cover between 100 and 300 acres, roughly the size of 200 football fields, right in the heart of Rome. It would include an artificial lake, vast gardens, vineyards, pastures with grazing animals, and even a forest with wild game, all within the city limits. The palace itself would be adorned with gold leaf, precious gems, and mother-of-pearl. The ceilings would rotate mechanically and shower guests with flowers and perfume. There would be a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, 120 feet tall, standing at the entrance, taller than the Statue of Liberty from ground to torch. Ancient historian Suetonius recorded Nero's reaction when the palace was completed: "At last I can begin to live like a human being." To Romans who had lost everything in the fire, this was an obscene slap in the face. Here was their emperor, building himself a pleasure palace on land that had been occupied by Roman homes, shops, and temples. Land that had been cleared by a fire that many now suspected he had ordered. The timing couldn't have looked worse. But was this proof of Nero's guilt? Not necessarily. Nero had been planning expansions to his palace for years. There are records of these plans dating before the fire. And to be fair, his rebuilding plans for Rome itself were actually sensible and progressive. Nero established new building codes for the entire city. Streets would be wider and laid out in a more rational grid pattern. Buildings would be limited in height and required to have fireproof walls and courtyards. A certain percentage of each structure had to be built from stone rather than wood. Property owners who rebuilt quickly according to the new specifications would receive financial incentives. Rome would emerge from the ashes as a planned, safer, more magnificent city. These were good policies. Policies that would have saved lives if they'd been implemented earlier. But none of this erased the central problem: the optics were terrible. While the emperor was building himself a golden palace, ordinary Romans were struggling to rebuild their lives. The resentment was building. The anger was growing. And the rumors about Nero's involvement in the fire were spreading out of control. Nero needed to redirect that anger. He needed someone else to blame. He needed a scapegoat. And he found one in Rome's newest, smallest, and least understood religious minority, the Christian. In 64 AD, Christianity was barely 3 decades old. It was a tiny sect, mostly concentrated in the eastern provinces of the empire, with only a small community in Rome itself. Most Romans had never heard of Christians, and those who had considered them a strange offshoot of Judaism, which itself was viewed with suspicion. Christians were easy to misunderstand and easier to fear. They refused to participate in the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a god, which Romans saw as basic civic duty, like pledging allegiance to a flag. Christians spoke of their religion in terms that sounded sinister to outsiders. They talked about consuming the body and blood of their god, which led to rumors of cannibalism. They called each other brother and sister and shared ritual kisses, which sparked rumors of incest. They met in secret, in private homes, which made them seem like a conspiracy. They spoke constantly of the end of the world, of a coming kingdom, of the current order being destroyed, which sounded like revolutionary talk. And perhaps most damning of all, their religion had been founded by a man who had been executed for sedition against Rome just 30 years earlier. Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified under Pontius Pilate for claiming to be the King of the Jews. A direct challenge to Roman authority. His followers were now claiming he had risen from the dead and would return to judge the living and the dead. To Roman ears, this was dangerous apocalyptic cult talk. So when Nero needed someone to blame for the fire, Christians were perfect targets. They were already disliked, already viewed with suspicion, already seen as enemies of Roman civilization. And their apocalyptic preaching about the world ending in flames? Well, that made them sound like exactly the kind of fanatics who would burn Rome. Tacitus, no friend to Christians himself, described what happened next. To suppress the rumor, Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians. Their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius' reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. But in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly superstition had broken out afresh, not only in Judea but even in Rome. The arrests began immediately. Christians were rounded up throughout the city. Under torture, standard Roman practice for extracting confessions from lower-class individuals, some Christians apparently named other Christians, allowing the authorities to expand their dragnet. Soon, according to Tacitus, a huge multitude had been arrested. But here's a crucial detail that often gets lost. Tacitus explicitly states that these Christians weren't convicted of arson. Read his words carefully. He says they were convicted of hatred of the human race, a charge often leveled at exclusive religious groups who separated themselves from mainstream Roman society. The fire was the excuse, but the charges were about their religion itself, about their rejection of Roman gods and Roman values. The question of whether any Christians actually started the fire is almost certainly no. There's no credible historical evidence to support it, and every reason to believe it was a fabricated pretext. But Nero needed the spectacle. He needed to show Romans that he had found the culprits, that justice was being done, that the guilty were being punished. And so began one of the most horrific episodes in early Christian history. What Nero did next went far beyond normal execution. He turned the punishment of Christians into public entertainment, into spectacular displays meant to satisfy the bloodlust of a traumatized and angry population. According to Tacitus, some Christians were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. But the most notorious punishment was reserved for evening entertainment in Nero's own gardens, which he had opened to the public. Christians were covered in pitch, tied to stakes, and set on fire to serve as human torches, illuminating the gardens after dark. Nero himself would mingle with the crowds during these spectacles, sometimes dressed as a charioteer. The emperor who loved to perform was now directing the ultimate dark theater. And here's where something unexpected happened. Roman public opinion began to shift. Tacitus, again no friend to Christians, admits that despite their guilt, which he took for granted, sympathy arose toward them because it appeared they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's cruelty. Even Romans who despised Christians, who believed they were dangerous cultists, began to feel that this was too much. The punishments were too creative, too sadistic, too much about Nero's entertainment rather than about justice. The spectacle was revealing something dark about their emperor, something that made even hardened Romans uncomfortable. The persecution had achieved its immediate goal, it redirected blame away from Nero and gave Romans a villain to hate. But it had also revealed Nero's capacity for cruelty in ways that would haunt his reputation forever. And for the tiny Christian community in Rome, it had created something powerful and enduring: martyrs. The blood of these early Christians, executed for a crime they didn't commit, would become the foundation story for centuries of Christian identity. The persecution that was meant to erase them would instead help define them. But in the summer of 64 AD, as the screams echoed through Nero's gardens and the smell of burning flesh mixed with the lingering smell of burnt Rome, no one could have predicted that this tiny persecuted sect would one day become the official religion of the very empire that was trying to destroy them. So did Nero actually do it? Did he order Rome to be burned so he could build his dream city? After 2,000 years, we still don't have a definitive answer, but we can examine the evidence with clear eyes. Let's start with what argues for Nero's innocence. First, he wasn't even in Rome when the fire started, he was 35 miles away in Antium. Multiple sources confirm this. Second, the fire destroyed several of Nero's own properties, including parts of his existing palace. Why would he burn his own possessions? Third, he responded quickly and effectively to the crisis, opening his buildings to refugees and organizing relief efforts. Fourth, Rome had a long history of devastating fires, this wasn't unprecedented. The city's construction made such disasters almost inevitable. And here's perhaps the strongest argument. Every single source that accuses Nero of starting the fire was written by his enemies, years after his death, by historians who had every reason to make him look as bad as possible. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all wrote under later emperors who had overthrown Nero's dynasty. These historians needed to justify that overthrow by portraying Nero as a monster. They had a political agenda. But now let's look at what argues against him. The timing was extraordinarily convenient. Nero had wanted to rebuild Rome for years, and suddenly a fire clears exactly the land he needs. The second outbreak of fire, starting on property belonging to his close associate, is deeply suspicious. Multiple witnesses claimed to see people preventing firefighting efforts and even starting new blazes. And then there's Nero's response. Instead of waiting a respectful period, he immediately announced plans for a massive palace complex on the cleared land. Perhaps most damning is this. Whether or not Nero actually started the fire, enough Romans believed he did that he felt compelled to create scapegoats. Innocent men don't usually need to blame someone else. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Did Nero personally order the fire? Almost certainly not. But did he take advantage of it to pursue his building projects? Absolutely. Did his response, building the Golden House while Romans suffered, show catastrophic political judgment? Without question. And did his persecution of Christians reveal a cruel and increasingly unstable ruler? The evidence speaks for itself. What we can say with certainty is this: whether or not Nero burned Rome, he destroyed himself. The fire marked the beginning of the end of his reign. The goodwill he had built during his early years was gone. The trust between emperor and people was broken. And his behavior in the years that followed would only make things worse. By 65 AD, just 1 year after the fire, Nero's paranoia had reached new heights. He saw enemies everywhere, and to be fair, he was right. A massive conspiracy was forming against him, one that would involve dozens of senators, equestrians, and even members of his own guard. The Pisonian conspiracy, named after its alleged leader Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was one of the most extensive plots against a Roman emperor ever recorded. The conspirators planned to assassinate Nero during the games at the Circus Maximus and install Piso as the new emperor. Among the conspirators was Seneca, Nero's former tutor and advisor, and Lucan, one of Rome's greatest poets and Nero's own cousin. But the conspiracy was betrayed. One of the plotters revealed the plan: and Nero's revenge was swift and brutal. Seneca was ordered to commit suicide. The elderly philosopher opened his veins in a bath, surrounded by his disciples, dictating his final thoughts, a scene that would be immortalized in countless paintings. Lucan was also forced to commit suicide, allegedly reciting his own poetry as he died. Piso killed himself rather than face public execution. In total, at least 19 people were executed, and many more were exiled or stripped of their property. But the purge didn't stop there. Nero's paranoia spiraled. Anyone who might pose a threat, anyone who had been close to the conspirators, anyone who had ever criticized him, all became targets. The Roman elite lived in terror, never knowing if they would be the next to receive that fatal message from the emperor. Among the executed was Petronius, the arbiter of elegance, at Nero's court and author of the Satyricon. Before dying, he wrote a letter to Nero detailing all of the emperor's sexual debaucheries and vices, then destroyed his signet ring so it couldn't be used to forge documents that would implicate others. Even in death, he was still protecting his friends from Nero's wrath. The empire was watching its emperor descend into tyranny. The young man who had once promised to respect the Senate and rule justly had become a murderous autocrat who saw threats in every shadow. And Romans began to wonder. How much longer could this continue? In 66 AD, Nero did something no Roman emperor had done before, he went on tour. Not a military campaign, an artistic tour. He traveled to Greece to compete in athletic and artistic competitions, performing in theaters and racing chariots in the Olympic Games. The Greeks, understanding how to flatter a powerful man, awarded him victory in every competition he entered, even the ones he didn't finish. When Nero fell out of his chariot during the Olympic chariot race, they still declared him the winner because, they said, he would have won if he had completed the race. Nero returned to Rome with 1,808 first-place prizes. But while Nero was indulging his artistic fantasies in Greece, the empire was beginning to fracture. In Judea, a Jewish revolt had erupted in 66 AD, a revolt that would eventually lead to the destruction of the Second Temple and the diaspora of the Jewish people. In Gaul, a governor named Gaius Julius Vindex was preparing to rebel. In Spain, the governor Galba was being courted by rebels who wanted him to become emperor. The Roman world was shifting beneath Nero's feet, and he was too consumed with his own artistic glory to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care. By this point, Nero seemed to live in a world of his own making, one where he was the greatest artist who had ever lived and reality was whatever he declared it to be. In March 68 AD, Vindex finally rebelled openly in Gaul, declaring that Nero was unfit to rule. Nero's response was telling. He was more upset about Vindex calling him a bad musician than about the actual rebellion. According to Suetonius, when Nero heard that Vindex had called him a bad lyre player, he wrote letters defending his musical abilities but barely mentioned the political revolt. The rebellion in Gaul was crushed by loyal troops, and Vindex committed suicide. But the damage was done. The spell was broken. A Roman governor had openly rebelled against the emperor and, even though he failed, he had shown that it could be done. More importantly, he had shown that many Romans would support such a rebellion. In Spain, Galba declared himself emperor with the support of his legions. In Africa, the governor joined Galba's cause. In Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own elite bodyguards, were wavering. They had protected Nero through the conspiracy, through the purges, through years of increasingly erratic behavior. But now they were asking themselves a dangerous question: why were they protecting an emperor that Rome itself had turned against? On June 8, 68 AD, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy and proclaimed Galba as the new emperor. The Praetorian Guard abandoned Nero. His advisors fled. His servants disappeared. The emperor who had once commanded the greatest empire on earth was suddenly, utterly alone. Nero fled Rome in the night, heading for a villa owned by one of his few remaining freedmen. As he rode through the darkness, he could hear the sounds of soldiers searching for him. He knew what awaited him: the Senate had condemned him to be beaten to death in the ancient fashion, stripped naked, his head fastened in a wooden fork, and flogged to death with rods. Nero would not give them that satisfaction. As soldiers approached the villa, the 30-year-old emperor pressed a dagger to his throat. His hand trembled. He couldn't do it. Finally, his secretary Epaphroditos helped him drive the blade home. Nero's alleged last words were, "Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me." Even in death, he was thinking about his art. In the days after Nero's death, something strange happened. While the Senate and the Roman elite celebrated the tyrant's demise, ordinary Romans, the same people who had suffered through the fire, who had lost their homes and families, began to mourn him. Flowers appeared on his tomb. People claimed to see his ghost. And rumors spread that Nero wasn't actually dead at all, that he had escaped to the east and would soon return at the head of a Parthian army to reclaim his throne. These rumors persisted for decades. At least 3 different impostors claimed to be Nero in the years following his death, each gathering substantial followings before being captured and executed. The legend of Nero's return became so powerful that it even influenced early Christian theology. Some scholars believe that the beast, in the Book of Revelation, written just a few decades after Nero's death, was coded language for either Nero himself or the expectation of his return. Why did ordinary Romans mourn an emperor who had persecuted Christians, murdered senators, and possibly burned their city? The answer reveals something important about Nero's reign that often gets lost in the sensational stories. Despite his cruelty toward the elite and his catastrophic judgment, Nero had actually been relatively popular with the common people. He had provided spectacular entertainment, gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, chariot races, all free to the public. He had kept grain prices low. His building codes after the fire, whatever his motivations, had made Rome genuinely safer. And perhaps most significantly, he had challenged the aristocratic order that ordinary Romans often resented. When Nero performed on stage, degrading himself in the eyes of the Senate, many common Romans saw it as the emperor making himself one of them. The elite saw a tyrant. The masses saw a performer who loved Rome enough to share the stage with them. Both views were true, in their way. Nero was complex. What physical evidence remains of Nero's reign and the Great Fire? Surprisingly more than you might think. Archaeological excavations in Rome have revealed layers of ash and debris dating precisely to 64 AD, confirming the scale of the destruction described by ancient historians. The fire line is visible in the archaeological record, showing which areas burned and which survived. Parts of the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house, still exist beneath Rome. In the 15th century, Renaissance artists including Raphael descended into what they thought were caves beneath the Esquiline Hill, only to discover they were actually inside Nero's buried palace. The frescoes and decorative styles they found there, which they called grotesques because they were found in grotto-like spaces, influenced Renaissance art throughout Europe. Ironically, Nero's artistic vision, which Romans of his own time found excessive and shameful, would inspire some of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. Today, you can still visit portions of the Domus Aurea, though much of it remains buried and unstable. Walking through those ancient corridors, beneath the vaulted ceilings that once rotated and showered flowers, past the walls that were once covered in gold leaf, you can almost glimpse Nero's dream. A palace that would make him immortal through beauty rather than conquest. But the palace never achieved what Nero wanted. After his death, his successors systematically erased it. The artificial lake was drained and the Colosseum was built on the site, literally constructing a monument to the people over Nero's private pleasure grounds. The baths of Trajan were built over other parts of the palace. The colossal statue of Nero was eventually modified to represent the sun god instead. Rome's new emperors wanted to erase Nero's memory, to bury his legacy as thoroughly as his palace would be buried. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Great Fire wasn't the physical destruction or even Nero's downfall, but what it meant for Christianity. The persecution that Nero initiated in the fire's aftermath established a template that would be repeated for the next 2.5 centuries. Christians would become Rome's favorite scapegoats, blamed for everything from military defeats to natural disasters to economic downturns. The logic was always the same. Christians refused to honor the Roman gods, therefore the gods were angry with Rome, therefore Rome's misfortunes were the Christians' fault. It was a simple equation that would justify waves of persecution under multiple emperors. But here's the paradox: persecution didn't destroy Christianity. It strengthened it. The courage of the martyrs became the religion's most powerful recruiting tool. As the early Christian writer Tertullian would famously observe around 200 AD, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Every execution created a story. Every martyr created a saint. Every act of brutality demonstrated that Christians were willing to die for their beliefs, which suggested to observers that maybe those beliefs were worth dying for." The very thing Rome did to eliminate Christianity helped it grow. By 313 AD, less than 250 years after Nero's persecution, Emperor Constantine would legalize Christianity. By 380 AD, it would become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The tiny sect that Nero tried to destroy would eventually inherit the empire itself. Members of the Roman elite who had once watched Christians burn as torches in Nero's gardens would eventually have Christian grandchildren and great-grandchildren. History has a sense of irony. So what's the truth about Nero and the fire? After examining all the evidence, weighing ancient sources against archaeology, considering political motivations and historical context, here's what we can say. The fire was almost certainly an accident, the inevitable result of Rome's chaotic urban planning and construction practices. Nero did not order it started, despite what his enemies claimed. But his response to the fire, particularly his rush to build the Golden House on cleared land, showed catastrophically poor judgment and fed suspicions of his guilt. The persecution of Christians was real and horrific, but it wasn't primarily about the fire. It was about religion, about control, about Nero's need to redirect public anger away from himself. The Christians were convenient victims, already disliked and misunderstood, easy to blame and easy to eliminate. Nero himself was neither the pure monster of legend nor the misunderstood artist some modern revisionists claim. He was a deeply flawed human being given absolute power at a young age, whose genuine artistic passions and early good intentions were corrupted by paranoia, cruelty, and a fatal disconnect between his self-image and reality. The fire destroyed much of Rome, but it built something too. It built myths, legends, and narratives that would shape Western civilization for 2 millennia. It gave us the image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. A story that appears nowhere in ancient sources but has become proverbial. It gave us the first large-scale Christian martyrdom, establishing patterns of persecution and resistance that would define the religion's identity. It gave us a cautionary tale about power, art, and the distance between an emperor's dreams and his people's needs. Standing in the ruins of Nero's palace today, or walking through Rome's streets where the fire once raged, we're left with questions that every generation must ask. What is the relationship between art and power? When does a leader's vision become tyranny? How do we judge historical figures? By their intentions or their actions, by their achievements or their crimes? Nero wanted to be remembered as the greatest artist who ever lived. Instead, he's remembered as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, even though he probably wasn't even in Rome when it started, and the fiddle hadn't been invented yet. He wanted to build a golden palace that would immortalize his name. Instead, his successors buried it and built monuments to the people on top of it. But in another sense, Nero got exactly what he wanted: immortality. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him, still debating his guilt, still fascinated by his story. He wanted to be the center of attention, the star of the show, the artist whose name would echo through history. And he is. Just not in the way he imagined. The Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days in July of 64 AD. But the questions it raised, about power and responsibility, about truth and propaganda, about the cost of vision and the price of cruelty. Those questions are still burning. They burn every time a leader prioritizes their legacy over their people's needs. They burn every time a minority group is scapegoated for a society's problems. They burn every time we have to separate historical truth from historical legend. Rome rebuilt itself from the ashes, stronger and safer than before. The Christians survived and eventually triumphed. The empire continued for centuries after Nero's death. But Nero himself became frozen in that moment of fire, forever associated with destruction whether he caused it or not, forever the emperor who burned Rome, in reputation if not in fact. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Nero and the Great Fire.